Okay, so let's get started. So I'd like to thank you for joining us at the AltDev Student Summit today, or just now. We're going to be talking to Mitu Khandaker, who's going to be talking about a day in the life of a solo developer. There's a link below the video where you can post questions for Mitu through Google Moderator. We'll be talking at the end with the questions and answers. There's a discussion going on Twitter. Use the hashtag AltDevConf. And that's it from me. Without further interruption, I'll turn it over to Mitu.
Okay, all right. Hi everyone, I'm Mitu Khandaker, and I'm a solo indie developer at my company, my one-woman studio, the Tiniest Shark. So I've been developing my first commercial game called Redshirt for the last 18 months. And so that's basically my day job. That's what I do. I'm also trying to finish a PhD as well at the same time, but we'll come back to that. So the game is being published by another indie developer, and I'll come back a bit later to sort of the project itself and how that all works a bit later. But today I'm just going to talk to you about a day in the life of a solo developer. And what that entails. And again, that's from sort of my own perspective as someone who's only really just sort of got started with my own indie studio over like the last year and a half. So I'm not saying that there's any right way of doing things, that there's any wrong way of doing things. It's just sort of about my experiences. Okay, so without further ado, let me load up my presentation and hope I get the right one. So share my desktop because I'm using a Mac. Okay, so day in the life of a solo developer. So jumping straight in. So as a solo developer, on a weekday you might typically get up before 8 AM and then hit the gym, go running, whatever, for half an hour because it's important for your general well-being and will make you a more productive, efficient person when it comes to your work. And obviously follow that up with a light and healthy breakfast. And then while you're doing that, you might want to sort of check your emails and make sure you're hitting inbox 0. Stay there at all times. And then typically I'd sort of start work by about 9 AM on the to-do list that I would have prepared the night before, and then just keep on crunching code, working through till lunch. Which is obviously a nice, healthy, balanced meal. And then, obviously don't forget about publicity for your game. Keep updating your blog and social media and stuff. And then just keep on working through the afternoon, finishing all the coding tasks on your to-do list. And also, sort of towards the end of the day, make sure you've got another comprehensive to-do list ready for the next day. And then, I'll typically try to finish working by about 7 or 8 at the very, very latest. And spend some time with my friends or my partner and play some games, generally relax, take a break. And same with the weekends, take some time off to relax because you earned, wait a minute, I think I've, give me a second. I'm sorry, I think I've loaded the wrong presentation. Let me go into the right one. Okay, let's do that. Okay, there we go. That's what I wanted to show you. Okay, so this is this is what I meant to put up. Okay, so wake up, maybe despair about your game not yet being finished. Have a little mini career crisis in the morning. Wondering if you can ever really ship your game. And then eventually, sort of start work sometime between 9 and 10. Look at your sort of massive list of emails, answer the most pressing ones which are really screaming at you, and then leave the rest for later. Then stare kind of overwhelmed at your to-do list. And then when you do get started on work, you'll inevitably get stuck working on a new bug which is suddenly and magically just materialized that day. And so you'll be working on that throughout the morning. Until you suddenly realize that it's 3 o'clock and you haven't eaten any lunch, and so you have to grab the quickest, unhealthiest thing you can find. And then finally, you can sometime in the afternoon begin completing tasks that were supposed to be done by the morning. So then check your emails again, totally forget to actually share sort of screenshots of the game or whatever on social media or your blog, or just be reluctant to because it doesn't look as great as you wanted it to look. And then basically continue grinding code, often into the early hours of the morning. And sometimes that's punctuated by sort of other work commitments you might have if you've got additional projects going on or whatever, or if you're like me and you're trying to finish a PhD. So it's important to maintain like a healthy work-work balance. Sometimes to be convinced by your friends or your partner to hang out or play games, all the while being consumed by an all-encompassing sense of guilt at not working. And then you just keep working, you know, until you feel this all-consuming sense of uncertainty about the future, and then you'll know it's time to sleep. And then, of course, the weekend. Okay, so it's not always that bad by any means, but that's not 1,000 miles from the truth either. The reality is somewhere between those two things. So sometimes things will be positive and sort of, you know, towards the happy shark end. But some more often than not, they're closer to the not so positive end. And that's certainly something which, in my experience, has sort of fluctuated as the project has kind of evolved, sort of depending on where in the sort of cycle I've been. So you can consider the sort of the first version to be what I think I should be doing, like the idealized thing. And the second one to be what all too often I end up doing. And that's not even mentioning option 3, what I feel like doing, which is falling to my knees and shaking my fists at myself in frustration. So basically, because all of this, being a solo developer, sort of depends on absolutely nothing but sort of yourself, like be that your personal circumstances or your sort of own motivation. It's incredibly changeable and it can change from day to day. When you're in this constant state of basically self-imposed crunch, you do come up against some weird motivational hurdles. And it's weird because on the one hand, you're working on sort of the game that you like, you know, the concept that you came up with and the game that you really want to be making. And that's really awesome. But at the same time, it's really tough. And it's easy to get demotivated by all kinds of things. You know, be that sort of, you know, tiny things going wrong to sort of imagining maybe sort of how much easier life could be if you were just sort of working for someone else in a quote-unquote real job. So before I go on though, I'm gonna I'll talk about my current game and sort of a quick sort of version of how I ended up working on it. So Redshirt is like a comedy sort of satirical game, sim game about social networking. So it's about being in this sort of typical sci-fi future where you're the most insignificant person on like a space station, and you've got to try and work your way up the social and career ladders using this the station's onboard spacebook. So the game's being published by Positech Games, who made games like Gratuitous Space Battles, Gratuitous Tank Battles, Kudos, Democracy, etc. I'd originally pitched the game to them as like a straight-up social networking parody game with no additional theming or anything. But sort of during the pitching process and stuff, we agreed that it would work better as sort of this with this sci-fi skin on. And so I ended up loving the idea even more. And so Redshirt was born. So it's an indie published game. And so the way that all works is via the sort of the milestones sort of method as per the traditional game publishing model, except it's obviously much more small scale and crucially much more human, I'd say. I like to think of it as basically non-evil publishing with sort of indies supporting newer indies, which I think is really excellent. A downside to sort of how the whole project has panned out so far is that I originally scoped the project to be about 8 to 10 months worth of work at most. I'm now in my 18th month of development. So basically, you know, things don't always sort of go the way that you might have planned. And so this is actually the first time that I've worked on a game of this magnitude, and obviously alone it was a bit of a sort of risky estimate. But it's definitely sort of in the final stretch now, which also obviously means that the size of the task list is also growing exponentially. So even though I'm doing all the coding and all the game design, it was originally agreed with the publisher that we'd outsource all of the art and all of the sort of sound and music. So that's the UI and character art. But then sort of as the project continued, I ended up sort of from my own end getting some additional sort of bits of help in here and there. So I got someone to do some AI consulting, which was the awesome Luke Dicken, who's your host here today. And I've also had a couple of friends who are good at copywriting, write a few bits of additional content for the game here and there. So I basically learnt where sort of tasks can be nicely compartmentalized, and you know someone who might be better at you than doing it. I think there's nothing wrong with getting them to help you work on it, even if you are like a solo indie. I'll whiz through this one because it's kind of a long story, but another valuable lesson I learned was one about tools. I mean, I decided early on that even though Redshirt is a game which by its very nature is one that's very much about interface, but I wanted to sort of use Unity to make things easier for myself and in terms of sort of making the game cross-platform, but that meant running into all kinds of issues. And I think sort of there's a lesson in there about using the right tool for the job, and again, it's a long story as to sort of why I feel that way. But I think that's a lesson which comes with experience, really. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I absolutely love Unity, and I'm definitely planning on using it for my next game, but it's one that would be sort of very different in nature from Redshirt. I'm sorry, I just realized I haven't actually, there we go. Help if I actually maximize that window. So I'm going to talk about workflow briefly, or sort of a fancy way of saying that so here are the tools I use to help me do my work, and here's how I use them. So while I'm working, I have two things, two browser tabs open at all times. So I have this website called workflowy.com, which is basically in fact, I might as well show you. So it's this nice sort of minimalist to-do list manager, and you can sort of give tags to different tasks. So what I tend to do is give sort of tag things by date, and then what I'll also do is once I've actually finished a task, you can sort of like hit complete here. I also have a Google Doc open at all times. So I type up what I've actually done, and I also that also gives me the chance to type up any additional stuff that I've worked on, so which wasn't in the to-do list, because inevitably there's stuff which comes up all the time, which you just go, oh, I should fix that too, or whatever. The other thing I do is if I go back to, where's my, so if I do screen share, okay. So I also have this this app which I absolutely love on the iPad called 3030, which is this sort of to-do list sort of app, and what it does is what I do is transfer my to-do list for a particular day onto here, sort of the night before or morning of or whatever, and you can basically assign sort of how much time each thing will take you, and then like you just hit go, and it will just keep sort of keep going through your task list and timing you for each thing, and it's really great. And basically, it sort of took me ages to find like a workflow that I was comfortable with. So that'll probably be the same for you. Like I tried all kinds of things, and you sort of eventually realize when things don't really work with sort of how you think or whatever. So I've sort of settled into like a nice set of tools which work for me. Okay, so if I go back to the presentation. Okay, cool. Oh yeah, and sometimes I have Netflix open as well at the same time, and sort of like I'm mainlining Deep Space Nine at the moment, to basically make up for the lack of actual social interaction throughout my day. Okay, another very, very important thing, source control. You should absolutely do it, and I don't think there's any question about it. It's a non-negotiable thing, and so even though you're a team of one person, and these things are sometimes designed sort of, for teams or whatever, it's absolutely worthwhile. Like you can't so the usefulness of having your version history and being able to revert to things is brilliant. So make sure you use something. I use Subversion because when I got into software development, that's just what I sort of formed the habit of using. But I guess the cool kids use Git or whatever these days. But whatever you use, commit often and with meaningful messages, which is also actually the reason that I started doing that thing where I type up everything I've been doing in Google Doc, because then I just sort of copy and paste things into my commit messages. Because otherwise I was just typing things like fixed some stuff or whatever, which isn't very helpful. So and the additional benefit of doing that is if you're like me and you sort of work on your PC sometimes and your laptop sometimes, it's super quick and easy to just switch between them. So I've said that already. The other thing I wanted to talk about was where you work. So I said sometimes I like to sort of just switch to my laptop and just sort of step away from where I'm working and just go somewhere else. I like being able to do that because I think one thing that gets overlooked sometimes by people when they're working on their own is just sort of place, and where you spend the most creative part of your day really matters. It kind of reminds me of that bit in Inception when Michael Caine's character talks about sort of working in his lecture theatre as opposed to his office because there's no space to think in his office. So I think place really does matter to sort of the creative process. I was fortunate when I started working on Redshirt and I started the Tiniest Shark, but my university, the University of Portsmouth in the UK, where I'm doing my PhD, they have like a really awesome sort of like business support center for students, and sort of like they do really great sort of business incubation and stuff. So I was lucky enough to be offered like a free office space in there. I made a real point of trying to sort of get away and actually use that space because I think it's so important to, for that sort of variety. Even though I inevitably ended up sort of going back home and working there as well. So it didn't really end up with the sort of work-home separation that I wanted originally, but it was still really useful. Unfortunately, as of a couple of months ago, that initiative lost the office space it was offering students, so I went back to working from home. So here's my setup at home. So I've basically bought into the funky standing desk thing that everybody's doing, except I've constructed mine out of a stack of books that I've just put my monitor on and other stuff on. I also added a second monitor to that after the first picture was taken, but my cat got in the way when I was trying to take a picture of that. So I was going to also say, that's my setup at home. Now, as both an indie and a grad student, I actually moved back in with my parents. So most of the time I'm there, sort of, that's my bedroom at my parents' house. Or sort of, right now I'm working from my partner's apartment in Seattle. But basically wherever my laptop is, that's where I'm working when I'm not at my PC. But on that note, sort of, I want to go back to talking about feelings because it's really important. I was really glad when I heard Michael Todd's talk at GDC in 2011, in which he openly spoke about his depression and how he, as a lone indie, dealt with it. And it's full of all kinds of invaluable advice. And if you're watching this session, you should watch that too. I was actually there sort of at GDC when that talk was given, and I remember watching it and thinking, hey, this is really good in theory and stuff, but I didn't think it was stuff that would ever apply to me. And now, sort of 18 months down the line, working on my own stuff, you kind of do realize how difficult it is. Even if you're not depressed as such, it's very easy to feel disheartened by stuff. And I think just being prepared for that will stop it from sort of blindsiding you if it does happen to you. But it's something that a lot of indies do talk about. And for that reason, what you should be doing is trying to sort of reach out to people, and ideally other indies, or at the very least people who do have otherwise similar lifestyles to you. I mean, I'm quite bad at doing that, but sort of be that over sort of IM or in person. It's tough to get yourself to do stuff like that though, because as I said before, you often feel like you're distracting yourself from real work if you're sort of doing anything other than, or basically doing anything other than work. And I do have very occasional in-person meetings with Redshirt publisher. And I also sort of, before the project and towards the beginning of it, tried to get to sort of indie meetups and events when I could. But sort of not living near like a thriving indie community, I found it sort of hard to do. It's hard to do that, both in terms of time and in terms of expense, once I started actually working on Redshirt. But your ability to sort of get out and meet up with other indies will depend entirely on your location, but you should absolutely do it if you can. Okay, so moving on. One thing I discovered about myself was about my own working habits and stuff. And so in terms of motivation and trying to keep myself motivated, there's a couple of things which I've just sort of picked up, which is actually useful to do. So I do actually always try and have my to-do list prepared for like the day ahead. And another great thing that I picked up, and I've actually seen other indies talk about doing this as well, is towards the end of the working day, like when you're actually going to just go and collapse into bed or whatever, leave like a minor task half done so you can pick up from there the next day. And don't have it be like a huge thing which you're going to be like stressing over and not be able to sleep if it's not finished, because I know that's going to be impossible. But yeah, if there's like a tiny thing, leave it half done so you can begin there the next day. Also, and this isn't always going to be possible throughout sort of all points of the project, but try and work on, if you're feeling particularly demotivated or whatever, try and pick like a perceivable difference thing and make that thing you work on. So whether that's sort of putting in some extra sounds or music or putting in extra bits of art, so something that's like, you know, that you can really see the change as opposed to some sort of obscure, tweaking some obscure numbers or whatever. So some other things quickly that I ran across. I didn't think this was going to be a problem for me, but I ended up actually finding it surprisingly difficult to wear multiple hats at the same time. I think when you really get settled into working on something, there's this temptation to just really zero in and focus on one aspect. And I find myself having to make a conscious effort to think about the bigger picture of what I'm doing. So for example, there was a several-month stretch where I was trying to get like UI and sort of some back-end stuff to work. And you know, I didn't look at the design doc once throughout that, and I almost forgot that it existed. And I'd made like a design doc at the sort of as part of the sort of pitching process. So and also just very quickly, as a programmer, I've always worked on very sort of self-contained, isolated projects. And so continuing to do this as a solo indie has meant that I've never really had someone who's like an amazing programmer sort of telling me the things that I've done wrong or whatever. So I've very much cultivated, even though I've been programming sort of, you know, since my teens or whatever, I've cultivated some terrible, terrible habits. And I think even if you are working by yourself, if you know someone who's like a lot better at programming than you are or whatever, definitely like show them and get them to just like point out the stuff that you're doing wrong, because otherwise you're not going to learn. Get an accountant, that's all I'll say, because there are people out there who like doing that kind of thing. And for your part, what you should do is just keep thorough records of everything, because the more records you keep, the easier it will be. Luckily for me, I'm a compulsive hoarder, so I do that anyway. But get an accountant. So I will whiz through that, because you probably aren't the sort of person who is going to be silly and try and finish a PhD at the same time as working on a solo indie game. But if you are someone who tends to say yes to things, you need to sort of think about whether that's something that you can reasonably do or not. So things I do differently next time. I will continue trying to follow the sort of positive, magical indie sort of schedule, but also be aware that it won't always happen, and probably, you know, and that's understandable that it won't always happen, but maybe with practice I'll sort of get better at it or whatever. I think next time we'll also pick a much smaller and simpler project, because, you know, just working on something with the scope of Redshirt for sort of my first proper big game that I'm working on is was a bit of a risky decision, but also more crucially, I try and be less afraid of talking about things. What I mean is sort of, you know, because I'm quite a perfectionist, I don't like sort of revealing sort of, you know, screenshots or whatever if it's not absolutely perfect. And again, that's like an aspect of perfectionism that I'd like to get over. Finally, keep working on the work guilt thing, because as I said, when you're in this state of self-imposed crunch, you end up feeling guilty when you're doing anything other than working. So you end up feeling guilty for having fun or whatever. But it's important to bear in mind that for creative people, you should always be consuming things, be that sort of, games, like other people's games, to books and beyond. So as a creative person, you shouldn't just be doing your own thing. So finally, it might be that none of this applies to you, because everybody's situation is entirely different. Bits of this might ring true, it might not, but I hope that it's been sort of helpful at least a little bit. But finally, it's lonely being an indie, but it's absolutely worth it to do what you love, which is creating the things you want to create in the medium that you love the most, and that's kind of what keeps me going. Okay.
Awesome, thank you very much.
No problem.
We are a little bit pushed for time, so if there's one quick question. Okay, so very quickly from John, have you got any tips on finding a non-evil publisher?
I don't really have any tips. I mean, so I was really lucky that I basically just heard through the grapevine that Positech was looking for indies to pitch to them, and so I just sort of I was like, hey, I've got this idea that I've been thinking of doing. Maybe I'll try my hand at doing that. So I went along and did that. But I know this, I'd really like to see more of that thing happening, and I'm sure sort of it probably will happen more. I feel like the sort of landscape has been kind of overshadowed by the whole Kickstarter thing recently, which is great, but I think we all know it's not going to sort of last forever, or maybe it will, or or even if it does, it's not necessarily something that would suit everybody. But I mean, there's things like Indie Fund, right, which I don't think they're taking submissions right now, but it's always worth keeping an eye on their webpage to see if they are. I know that I think Jason Della Rocca just started like an indie incubator for Canadian game developers, so that's something to look into as well. But it's definitely something I hope to see popping up more. And I think just keep in touch with like the indie community, and I think sort of just by doing that is just how sort of it just happened for me.
Awesome, thank you very much, Mitu. That's a great talk, great session, but we have to move on to the next thing.
Okay, so. Okay, great. Thank you for having me.
Okay, we will catch you later. For everybody watching live, the student showcase is up next. So if you just give us a couple of minutes to get that set up, and then if you watch Facebook and Twitter, we'll be posting a link in there. Thanks again to Mitu, and we'll catch you around.
Hey, thanks for watching.